Italy was known as Rome, standing out apart from the four great civilizations. Back in the day, Italy was definitely a nation of warriors, sweeping across Europe. At its peak, the Roman Empire was a superpower spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. Remember the Jews wandering for thousands of years? That was all thanks to the Romans. But in 395 AD, Rome split into the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Although they weren't as powerful as before, they still dominated Europe. That's why, when many European countries later became powerful, they proudly claimed to be the descendants of Romans, considering it an honor. By the 14th century, everything changed. The start of the Renaissance led to a major shift in Italian society. Imagine Conan the Barbarian suddenly focusing on calligraphy. That's basically what happened with Italy. The Italians, having mastered the art scene, became unstoppable. It was like they had unlocked some secret power. Talent started popping up everywhere. For example, remember learning about free fall in school? That experiment with dropping a ball from the Leaning Tower of Pisa was Galileo, an Italian. And then there's Leonardo da Vinci, the guy who could paint an egg as well as anything else, and Michelangelo, the sculptor. Along with Raphael, they're known as the Big Three of the Renaissance, all Italian. This era sparked deep Italian romanticism. After centuries of artistic focus, Italians traded weapons for pens, immersing themselves in art and neglecting war. But this endless celebration led to chaos, fragmenting the country. Realizing the turmoil was disrupting their creativity, Italy knew it was time to unify and seek stability. By 1870, Italy achieved unification, but it lagged behind other European powers in industrialization. Positioned near the heart of Europe, Italy needed to bolster its economy to avoid falling further behind. With industrial growth slow and imports costly, Italy needed to make money, and the solution was to follow others' lead. Since European countries were expanding their colonies, Italy decided it needed one too. By the late 19th century, as Europe expanded into Africa, Italy targeted Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, beginning a complex relationship between the two. In 1885, Italy made its first invasion of Ethiopia. It was a sudden move, and Ethiopia wasn't prepared. Although they resisted, they suffered significant losses. However, Italy's forces were too few. They were just testing the waters. With such a small army, they couldn't conquer such a vast country. They ended up negotiating, and Italy got a port in return. This initial success left Italy wanting more. They saw others claiming large territories and felt dissatisfied with just a port. So, in 1895, after a decade of preparation, Italy decided to try again. They brought over 10,000 modern troops armed with machine guns and artillery to face an African country still in the tribal era. Ethiopia had a population of about 100,000, but their weapons were old-fashioned, using long rifles and crude artillery. Despite the odds, the Italian forces were defeated and their army was wiped out. By the end of the 19th century, Africa had only two independent countries, Liberia, which was protected by the United States, and Ethiopia. Ethiopia was fortunate enough to not only fend off the Italians, but also receive over 10 million lire in compensation, equivalent to about $200,000. An imperialist country paying compensation to a tribal-era African nation left Ethiopia with a significant place in the history of resisting invasion. Italy was left red-faced, as if they'd been humiliated. They had tried to conquer Ethiopia, but ended up losing. The Italians remained bitter about it for years. After a 40-year break, they decided to make another attempt. This time, Italy was serious. They assembled 400,000 troops, 300 tanks, and 500 airplanes, nearly exhausting their entire arsenal. They were ready to fight a tribal country as if they were taking on France. They even used chemical weapons. By 1936, Italy finally achieved its goal and made Ethiopia a colony. But once they occupied Ethiopia, the Italians were shocked. Colonies are supposed to be profitable, but they found themselves with no money, no resources, and even a food shortage. Before the invasion, Ethiopia was barely self-sufficient, but the war disrupted agriculture. With no local food production, the Ethiopians began to revolt. Italy had no choice but to buy food from home and send it over, subsidizing the Ethiopians. This made Italy look bad. Italy's plan to exploit Ethiopia more effectively involved improving the country's infrastructure. They realized that to profit from their colony, they first needed to develop it, starting with building roads. From 1936 to 1941, Italy poured over 20 billion lire into Ethiopia, constructing over 7,000 kilometers of roads and setting up various factories, from livestock farms to mining operations and food processing plants. To keep these factories running efficiently, Italy built power plants to address electricity shortages and water treatment plants to combat illnesses caused by well water. As workers living in close quarters began spreading diseases, Italy also constructed hospitals to improve living conditions and maintain productivity. It was as if Italy was playing a real-life version of SimCity, using their new colony as a giant construction project. The Italians were fully committed to their efforts in Ethiopia, pouring tens of billions of lire into the region annually. To put that into perspective, at the time, it cost about 300 million lire to build a light aircraft carrier for the Italian Navy. But once they started, there was no turning back. They had already invested so much that stopping was not an option. By 1941, the United States had entered the war, quickly turning the tide. With America's involvement, Ethiopian guerrilla fighters received a significant amount of modern weaponry, and British forces also came to their aid. Italy couldn't withstand this combined pressure. After 5 years of painstaking efforts and spending hundreds of billions of lire, Italy's colonial ambitions in Ethiopia crumbled. Supporting their efforts in Ethiopia had drained Italy's resources. They had essentially emptied their national treasury, tightening their belts, only to see their hard-fought gains disappear almost overnight. By 1943, after Italy surrendered to the Allied forces, they were so broke that they had given all their food supplies to the Ethiopians and kept none for themselves. That's the story of Italy and the war in Ethiopia. Now, back to 1914, Italy was initially aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but chose to remain neutral when World War I began. Germany was already in a tough spot, facing powerful enemies like Britain, France, and Russia, while its allies faltered. Italy was unreliable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was plagued by internal strife, and the Ottoman Empire was in decline. Seeing an opportunity for territorial gains from Austria-Hungary, Italy switched sides in 1915 and joined the Allies under the Treaty of London. The Italian military performance was so poor that in some cases, hundreds of German soldiers could charge and have thousands of Italian soldiers surrender on the spot. The Allies were concerned that Italy's ineptitude might lead to losses for their side. To prevent this, they reluctantly gave Italy some support, though it was barely enough to make a difference. By World War II, Italy was firmly aligned with Germany. Let's move beyond the typical narrative of Italy's military shortcomings and recognize some of their notable achievements. For example, one of the few Italy's Marshal, Italo Balbo, who was a prominent figure in the military, sometimes seen as a possible successor to dictator Benito Mussolini. In 1940, on the North African front, Italian forces were on high alert as British planes appeared overhead. As the British launched an air raid, many of the Italian anti-aircraft gunners panicked and abandoned their posts. However, one of the guns was manned by a determined crew who successfully shot down an enemy aircraft, sparking celebrations in the Italian camp. Just 20 minutes later, another plane was spotted in the distance. The gunners, emboldened by their earlier success, fired again, bringing down the aircraft with a single shot. The Italian camp buzzed with excitement until a telegram arrived, revealing shocking news. Marshal Italo Balbo had been killed. His personal plane was mistakenly shot down by the very anti-aircraft guns intended to protect the camp. This dramatization reflects the chaotic and ironic situations Italy faced during the war. So why did Germany ally with Italy in World War II after such a track record? In Europe, Italy was one of the few viable options at the time. The major world powers, Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States, were all wealthy and well-established, making them less inclined to engage in conflict. Germany, on the other hand, had come late to the Industrial Revolution. By the time it was ready to expand, much of the desirable colonial territory had already been taken or destroyed. In World War II, Germany found itself with very limited colonial assets left, all of which had been divided up by others. If Germany wanted to grow and exert influence, it needed allies. The major powers weren't interested in cooperating, so Germany had to look for partners among the smaller European nations. Italy, despite its flaws, was still a significant player in Europe. At that time, Italy seemed relatively strong with its robust industrial base and substantial population. Italians, known for their romantic nature, had a high birth rate, which boosted their numbers. Wars often revolved around who could muster the most people, and Italy's population was quite competitive with France's. But the Italian military was unexpectedly weak, crumbling at the slightest provocation. Why? A major reason was Italy's lack of emphasis on education. Italians prioritized the arts, valuing creativity over rigorous academic or military training. Their schools were more about technical jargon than real learning, and the military lacked the discipline essential for effective combat. Unlike Britain, France, and Germany, which had strong military academies, Italy's military was poorly prepared, with many soldiers lacking proper training. Despite being a cultural powerhouse, Italy's historical role didn't translate into military strength, and in the World Wars, their military efforts often fell short of expectations. Despite their poor showing in the wars, Italy experienced one of the fastest economic recoveries after World War II. Although they were a defeated nation and had to pay reparations, their economy rebounded remarkably quickly. From the 1950s to the 1970s, Italy's GDP doubled, showcasing one of the most rapid recoveries among post-war nations. Why did Italy's economy recover so quickly? First, while Italy experienced significant destruction during World War II, particularly after the Allied invasion in 1943 and the internal conflicts that followed, the damage was less severe than in countries like Germany or Poland. Italy's early surrender to the Allies in 1943, followed by the collapse of Mussolini's regime, helped avoid further prolonged devastation. Though often criticized for frequent defeats and rapid surrenders, this strategy of withdrawing from protracted conflict allowed Italy to limit damage and recover more quickly after the war. Additionally, a crucial element of Italy's post-war recovery was its labor market and industrial strategy. Italy faced challenges such as higher rates of illiteracy and a lower average level of education compared to other Western European nations. However, this meant Italian workers were willing to accept lower wages, making Italy an attractive hub for affordable production. Brands like Fiat became central to the country's economic revival, producing cars that were popular across Europe despite economic difficulties. Italy's focus on industry and labor flexibility enabled a rapid recovery and helped establish the foundation for its post-war economic boom. However, by the 1980s and 1990s, Italy's traditional manufacturing model began to struggle as production shifted to Southeast Asia, where labor costs were even lower. In response, Italy leaned into the booming luxury goods market, capitalizing on its rich artistic heritage to appeal to affluent consumers, particularly from Japan. This shift helped sustain the economy during a period of global change. Looking back, Italy has often been the subject of mockery for its historical military failures and its perceived focus on simple pleasures like pasta, wine, and football. Yet, the country's ability to navigate economic shifts and recover from adversity demonstrates a unique strength. Though this journey began over a century ago, Italy's capacity to adapt remains a remarkable story of perseverance.